Um, we were asked to specifically talk about European EdTech entrepreneurship. One of the things that I'm always really intrigued with, and frankly, the more I've been involved in this sphere, the more I find I want to be trying to define terminologies. Because one of the things that I think for us, let's say in the academic world, and I'm assuming because of this network, many of you in the audience today are potentially working in universities, for example. It's often, I think we recognize the need for finding common language, trying to understand how we might differently define or expose ourselves to different concepts. And so what I'd like to do is to focus around a few of the various assumptions that I feel that certainly in our experience here in Finland and with regards to the kind of programs that we've been developing in the EdTech sphere over the last 10 years, we keep coming back to. And I think to start off with, one of the things Marie was just mentioning, the idea of innovation. And for me personally, what I find I'm increasingly coming back to is innovation actually, we have to recognize, has a commercialization aspect to it. If we want to talk about developing classrooms or developing pedagogy or developing teacher training, to me, that's not necessarily innovation. It might be development, it might be building quality. But if we're going to use the word innovation, certainly from my perspective, something I want to emphasize today is there is this commercialization aspect to innovation. It's the idea of finding something, making it into a product or service that is actually viable in a particular market. And so how innovation then connects into entrepreneurship is the idea of, okay, how do we potentially support and create entrepreneurs who are actually able to then act in that space of innovation. And so the idea of helping them to build or expand or pivot new products or services that can potentially address some of the issues, for example, that Maria and Alison very eloquently discussed. So this is one of the things that to start with. And in Finland, there's a saying, and Johanna can always correct my Finnish, but nostetaan kissa pöydällä. So what that really means is you put the cat on the table. So I think in English that might be the elephant in the room, but you often want to put the cat on the table to really say, okay, what are we really talking about? What are the things behind what we're talking about? And so there's some assumptions I want to bring up, and again, remember I'm doing this as a bit of a devil's advocate, so I really do want to see some activity in the chat, see where some of the perspectives are among our panelists and our audience members. So the number one assumption that I feel that we hear basically daily in our work in education innovation is this idea of scale. So if you're going to create a product or a service, you got to build it to scale. And so the design, the potential outputs or the potential outcomes, you're really looking for scale. And frankly, this is, I think, a terminology or an assumption that you're definitely getting from the investment community. We can hear more from Maria and others that I think are very connected to the EdTech investment community, but you really hear this constantly. Now, the challenge I want to pose to the group today, though, is does successful education innovation actually happen, though, at scale, or can it happen without scale? And so the idea of supporting effectiveness in pedagogy or supporting development of education systems, can that actually be done localized? Or are we talking about innovation having to be equated with scale? And I'll just bring up an example where I've been having some conversations with education entrepreneurs recently where they've realized that their efforts to build something that will scale to be some kind of global-minded company or product, in many ways sometimes isn't necessarily suited to, for example, supporting student success in a classroom level. And so they have to balance potentially things that are sometimes on either side of a spectrum. So a challenge then to the audience here is really, in your experience, does the idea of building successful innovation actually happen at the local level, and that's what we need to focus on? Or is it something that we really need to take the global view and view that success happens only there? So something to challenge everyone with. The next assumption is this idea of technology as disruptor. And so again, Maria, if I can refer back to one of your comments, mentioning about the definitions of EdTech and how it's very much focusing on a technology. I think we're all definitely I think there's a strong consensus that technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, augmented reality, these technologies are having a hugely disruptive um, position in the education sphere. But what I want to challenge then with this group is, with regards again to the effectiveness of innovation, is it something that really we have to focus on the high tech? So the idea of machine learning, you know, I would argue personally that machine learning is pretty high on the hype cycle right now. But are we also then looking at low tech? And when you look at organizations and projects such as EdTech Hub, which is quite an interesting long-term funded project based in Europe and in the Americas, and they're really focusing in emerging markets, and for example in developing countries such as in Southeast Asia or in Africa. And one of the things that they often have reminded us as a group when they talk to us, learnings from, for example, the World Bank or UNICEF or some of these other larger global organizations, is they say, actually look towards the low tech, look towards the technology that's already in existence in those locations. So if really the one of the most commonly used technology is radio, well, why don't you actually then build your development of education using radio? Now, in the European context, if I was to go to an investor and say, I've got this fantastic education product and I'm thinking of using radio, well, you know, you probably wouldn't have very much of a discussion. But ultimately, it's these contextual issues that, again, in the previous conversation we talked about, that there can be some very different aspects to consider in terms of where the innovation can take place. So something, again, to challenge the group. The third assumption that I'd like to talk about then is this idea of co-creation. And in Finland and in the Nordics, I think definitely co-creation is something that's really talked about a lot. I'd like to argue that I think Finland and the Nordics are pretty good at this right now and really leading globally in many ways about how to support co-creation in the education innovation sphere. Some really interesting national funded programs here in Finland and elsewhere in the Nordics that you should look into. But there is this assumption that co-creation is good, that we should be doing this. And the idea of connecting EdTech or education innovation companies with schools or with others who can help them to co-create is a really good process. And one of the challenges then, or the thing that I would like to challenge this group, is one of the things that you'll see in co-creation in these kind of models is you'll have, on the one side, you'll have the companies saying that this really helps with product design. It potentially really helps with allowing for companies to make inroads into potential client groups or into new markets. So the idea of testing with schools can help the company or help entrepreneurs in their journey. Whereas one of the arguments that said of why this is beneficial for others is that it supposedly supports teacher development, and it helps schools to get access to the best new technologies and these sorts of things. But finding a balance to that and finding a way that you can actually provide meaningful development for an actual teacher or actual development in a classroom with the students, in many ways still that's very hard to measure and to observe. So this is also the challenge that then I'd say for this audience today, is if you are involved in co-creation or if you're wanting to develop in this pathway, to really spend some time with regards to how you're actually going to measure that and how you're going to support let's say what I would argue is a balanced approach to not only the commercialization side of innovation, but also the pedagogy side of innovation that I think we all want to see. So what this then points to is there the need for potentially at the European level to potentially focus on some issues such as student success. You know, student success is something that you don't often hear as, let's say, one of the first things you talk about in innovation. But definitely, I think increasingly, what's very I think a positive step is when you're talking with innovation ecosystems in this sphere, there is a lot more talk about pedagogy. And for example, pedagogy first, and these sorts of sayings that you're now hearing. And so again, what I would pose to all of us in this field, whether it's on the private sector in the investment sphere, whether it's people who see themselves as educators, really kind of at the local level in classrooms, something to consider how we can balance this out. And ultimately, the thing I'd like to then leave with everyone is, when we're looking at EdTech entrepreneurship and education entrepreneurship, which is something we're very interested in here, and specifically with our master's program here in Oulu, is the idea of how much are we actually wanting to develop entrepreneurs and create new startups? How much is that a key performance indicator of the kind of work we're doing? Or is it something that we need to actually refocus more on the aspect of developing the mindset? And so maybe not necessarily worrying so much about how many entrepreneurs we're actually pumping out of the system, but are we actually at the same time engendering a real advancement of the overall entrepreneurship mindset across the board? So whether it's at the leadership level in a university, or whether it's somebody who is actually specifically trying to create some kind of new product or service. I think certainly from our learning, I think there's the real need to potentially think of how this mindset can infuse across the board, across the system. And that in itself can potentially allow for some of these combinations and collaborations that I think in the earlier presentation we were hearing as a positive step. So I'll stop there and hope that, for example, we could maybe start hearing from some of our co-panelists if there's any comments or questions, but also really intrigued to see if there's any thoughts or suggestions coming from the audience as well. So thanks very much, and Milena, we'll pass it back to you.
Thanks so much, Blair. Let me have a look at the list of our questions. I don't see any question appearing here on what you were saying, but actually I wanted to ask one myself. You mentioned your master in education entrepreneurship. I think you're starting with the third or fourth cohort already. I remember that when we met, you were just kicking off the program. What are the main lessons learned when you look at people who want to innovate in the field of educational entrepreneurship? How has it changed in the past 4 years?
Well, it's a good question. I think definitely the sector is really advancing quickly, and from Allison and Maria, we were definitely hearing of some of those trends over the last 4 years. So we're just entering into our fourth cohort. It's a 1-year executive style master's program. So the cohort that we work with here in Oulu is a global cohort. So these are professionals who really see this as a way of supporting their professional work, rather than, let's say, the traditional academic pathway from a bachelor's, master's into a PhD. These are often individuals who are very much immersed in professional work. So they're working at the same time. And actually, over these 4 years, it's actually been very consistent in terms of the kind of balance we're often seeing. Certainly, it's been a very concerted effort of ours to create an environment where there's many different perspectives. But what we're finding is that there's not only those individuals who really see the interest to create something that is theirs, that they would define themselves as an entrepreneur, but we're also seeing equally the same amount, for example, of people who consider themselves intrapreneurs. So this idea of using the entrepreneurial mindset to help them develop the education in their institution or inside their organization. So again, we'll use the word innovation, but I think for those of us who work in a university, so here Johanna and I work in a public university here in Finland, the idea of innovation and commercialization certainly is something that gets talked about, but the idea of how an entrepreneurial mindset can help us develop and enhance the kind of products and services that we offer at the public level. I would argue that even though we may not be creating new revenue streams, or which we actually are, but in other ways, it can potentially really help us to look at whether there's particular gaps that we can address within some of the traditional ways that education is done in various sectors. So whether that's an elementary school classroom teacher who we have, for example, as a potential student, all the way to somebody who works in some of the very largest multinational technology companies, such as the Googles and the Microsofts of the world. So in many ways, it's looking at how this mindset can potentially support. And we actually have many people who go through the program thinking they're going to be an entrepreneur at the beginning, and they realize, like, oh, you know what? I don't think this is actually this isn't what I'm looking for. I think there's other ways for me to make an impact without necessarily being an entrepreneur. But I'm definitely learning from this to help me move into a new professional pathway. So hopefully that helps to clarify.
Definitely, thanks so much. And I could see that new questions appeared in the Q&A, but before that, Alison is raising her hand. So Alison, would you like to ask your question?
It was a comment actually, which will probably lead into a question, but I'm really interested in something that we observed. I think many of you know I was involved in the Educate program at UCL, which is open again for EdTech. So please go see Roland later because they're back open again. And one of the things that I observed in my role of research mentoring 250 odd companies was that all of these innovations, what we found was our founders were very value driven, Blair. They came into this because they cared about something that had some connection with education and the system. We didn't see entrepreneurs who, you know, really that money line was what they were chasing. We saw a very different type of entrepreneur. And I just wanted to question really that when we're talking about developing that mindset, what does that look like for educational entrepreneurs as opposed to a broader sort of understanding of entrepreneurs?
That's a really great question, and something there definitely has to be a lot more time spent looking into this. I think there's some really interesting research that's going on globally. I think more so in the area of social impact. And for example, I think you'll hear there's quite a bit, I think, that's been done more in the field of social entrepreneurship. And so I think for us that, if we call ourselves education entrepreneurs or education entrepreneurship people, I think we should be drawing upon that, because there's already, I think, a really interesting view in terms of how those values that potentially drive a lot of the individuals into this sphere impact on how they actually see themselves and what they see as success as an entrepreneur. So I think one of the things we've again been seeing is the interest to often come back to what we hear people talking about in this kind of that localized level. So if people in their process of going through an entrepreneurship methodology or an entrepreneur journey, if they can see that there is an impact at the student level that isn't necessarily measured in a business sense in terms of profits or these sorts of things, but if that mindset can help them to that stage, then I think they're finding, let's say, a balance between many potentially competing interests as an entrepreneur, because you can have some amazing ideas, but if they're not going to be innovative to the sense of being commercially viable, then you're not going to get very far, even at the local level. And I think a lot of education entrepreneurs are realizing that. So it's this idea of how do you reconcile both, let's say, some of these very strongly focused pedagogical interests and student-centered interests, with how do you make these kind of developments sustainable and viable. And to me, it's that sustainable issue that really comes back to what the entrepreneurship mindset can bring. So the idea of us having a financial modeling course in our program for us is highly essential, because the one side can be pedagogy, which, for example, Johanna teaches in our program, but then to have others who can really look at the business side, hugely important. So it's how to balance those. So I maybe that was a bit of a diplomatic answer, but yeah, absolutely, definitely one of the questions we have to look at into the future.
Yeah, and I think putting the challenge back to Maria and Holon IQ is, we saw everything was measured in dollars in those slides. And is there another measure that somehow captures? Have we got the right actual measurement unit that is universal and understood, that really gets at that, addressing what these values capture? So the bits you can't measure in money and I think that's something that our community can really try and shape in a proper co-creation way. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Blair. And following on this question, actually, Evelyn here is asking, what's on the point of mindset, where to start? Is there a different way of doing things? So we talk a lot about entrepreneurial mindset and mindset in general, and how to start, where to start, what do we do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe I'll start with that, and happy to hear any from the other panelists as well. And actually, I'm just reading another comment from Peter that I think is a great way to think of this, is that it's not necessarily an either or, but I think with regards to where we can learn from the innovation side of things, the design, the product design aspect, which is also a part of our program, where there's a core pillar of service design. is this idea of the gaps. So where to start is often if there's challenges, if there's something that's not working right, whether it's in Finland, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's in Bangladesh. So if there's somebody within that context who sees something that's not necessarily performing well, or if there's a real challenge, really one idea is to potentially start with that. And I think for many people aware of the design cycle, often people are talking about what's the challenge, what's the gap that you're potentially going to address. And so I think in many ways that's a core part of the entrepreneurship journey. And so that would be one of my suggestions, is really to look at where some of those challenges are, and then ultimately that leads you to many other people around the world who are probably interested in the same challenge.
And to be honest, if I can add something on that, because every time when I talk about lifelong learning with during other talks, it's a very similar question. So there are these top 10 skills. How do I start? How do I develop them? And very often the answer is just look at your own set of skills and see where you are missing something, as you were saying. So it can apply not only to entrepreneurship, but really to any other field when we are talking about developing our mindsets, our skills. So look what's needed, look at yourself, analyze it, and just go for the one that is most useful for you at the moment. Mm-hmm. Johanna, I can see that you are raising a hand.
Thanks, Milena. I had just one comment that came to my mind. So when we think about the entrepreneurial mindset and education, how those two things could be merged is, I think that for educators to actually learn some of these entrepreneurial skills is a way of kind of empowering them. So in Finland, where we have a really high level of autonomy for teachers, this is something kind of, well, it's not that new here, but I don't know, maybe in other educational systems, it might not be that obvious. So maybe to try to find these skills, like you mentioned, the skills that really support the entrepreneurial mindset and kind of innovating within your own profession or your own workplace. It's a way of kind of finding purpose to your job and really creating a difference. So that's one of the things that you can learn by investing or researching these things.
Very good point, Johanna. Thanks so much. And to everyone who, if you haven't had a chance to go to Finland and see how it works over there, we right before the lockdown, we had a chance to visit Oulu, and it was a great experience, because it's true that every single country is different, and going and visiting and understanding how, for example, about the teacher's autonomy that you mentioned, every single place in Europe will have this slightly different strategy, slightly different culture, and entrepreneurship is the challenge for EdTech entrepreneurship in Europe. I think one of them is how to adjust to these different market needs and these different market cultures.
Yeah, just continuing on that, because it's also a way of kind of localizing the educational innovations, like Blair mentioned, that not every country has to be the same, because I think there's a value in the richness of the cultures, and we cannot, like from Finland, we can't go and say, okay, this is the way everyone should do it, because it's obviously not going to work. So, but to kind of, it is about learning this mindset and how to kind of adapt, or how to do things in your own way, that it's suitable in your own system and in your own country, that works the best and also ultimately leads to the best learning experience and results for the students.
Absolutely. And following on this one, we have one question here from Eric, and it's a long question. I will read it. If public universities start to use commercial EdTech tools like Google Classroom, etc., and the expenses of the open source community-driven tools, will that be the end of open source LMS? Or if not public universities, who else is using community-driven EdTech innovation? At the same time, startups are usually faster and offering easier to use and more sophisticated solutions. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a whole other piece that you'll notice that I didn't necessarily talk about the the dichotomy between the public and the private, which is also, that's a whole other seminar and webinar, I think. But I'll certainly maybe start from my perspective here, being somebody working in the Finnish system. And for those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with the Finnish system, I would certainly argue that Finland's education system is one of the most on the, let's say, public side of the spectrum. So private schooling is definitely is not something you really see here in our country, as opposed to many other countries where, for example, the private sector is a part of the education system that that's very, very important and very involved. So I think from our side, it's looking at how there is this interplay. And so, as Johanna mentions, the idea of how every context is going to be different, but I would also argue that there's going to be a different interplay between the private sector and private investment and the public sector, and how the public sector decides to engage with that. I think, again, that was a term that Alison and Maria used that I would also agree is kind of how do those two sectors engage with each other. And certainly Finland and the Finnish government, both at the city level, which has a very strong impact in education, and also the national level with regards to curriculum and such, there's a very particular way that they want to engage with private products and private offerings and private investment. Now that might be, of course, and is very different than the American context. And I think Maria's diagram showed some of that very, very clearly. So I think how the public sector decides to organize itself and to engage with these kind of offerings, I would argue is one of the kind of core things to potentially look at. And ultimately that will then really define how much, let's say, open source offerings and content and systems will be able to be used or expanded. And so I think something to potentially look into. So Eric, hopefully that gave you a little sense from the Finnish system, but again, we happy to go into much more detail.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Blair, and thank you, Johanna. And before we'll move on to Wim's presentation, there's one question. Can you think of a reason why there's no global Facebook for education yet? And I'll take on this question and answer. There will be. We are building it. So later on, I will let you know about our platform that we are developing, and hopefully this will be this little step towards the Facebook for education that we are thinking of. I cannot think of any reason why not.